Hello and welcome to another episode of Ears to Hear. John, it's good to see you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Andrew. How are you doing? We have switched roles.
We're doing well, yeah. First voice you hear is me. You might have jumped out of your seat when you heard that, thinking,
what a change.
What happened? I just switched episodes. I just must have gotten onto some other podcast here.
Yeah.
But we're glad of you to listen. Thanks for listening to us. We wanted to talk today about the idea of bias, particularly within the church, and specifically when it comes to racial bias or prejudice that may exist. And I think that this is an interesting topic and certainly an important one to talk about. And it's one that sometimes people may feel like, oh, really? We're going to talk about that. I've heard it said before. I've heard a sentiment before that we should be past all that. Slavery ended generations ago. Jim Crow laws ended generations ago. Aren't we beyond all that as a society?
We should be.
And every society ought to be, but you look around in the world and you definitely see so much to the contrary.
Yeah. Don't you think one of the reasons we should be is just because God's impartial, and that in an effort to be holy as God is holy, we should be impartial and not look at things, is it like when David is chosen, and it's when the Lord is speaking to Samuel, he says, don't look at his appearance. The Lord doesn't look like man looks.
Yeah. Well, there you go, John. You wrapped it up. We can call that a day. Thanks for listening to Ears to Hear.
That's what we aspire to.
We aspire to the impartiality that the Lord shows. Yeah. I think a lot of the times we might go to passages like Ephesians chapter 4, where it talks about the body. There's unity in the body of Christ, that there is one baptism, one Lord, one faith, one God, one calling. And, you read those verses and you say, all right, well, it's done. It's settled. It should be a settled matter. But, the very reason that Paul had to write to churches, there was bias, there was prejudice going on in the early church, certainly. We'll talk about that. There can just as easily be bias and prejudice going on in the church today. So that's what we're going to be looking at. One thing I did want to start with as we intro this topic is just the importance of understanding bias where it exists. And really, it takes educating ourselves to try to sniff it out and see it when it occurs. And I think a lot of the time when we bring it up, people start feeling a bit attacked because they associate bias with, well, that means I'm an overt racist, and that means that I'm being maliciously racist toward people and intentionally racist and evil. And so people might start to get defensive, feeling like, whoa, why am I being lectured to on this? I'm not racist. And there's intentional bias for sure that has happened in the past, and I believe still happens, but there's also unintended bias that can occur. So, we're not saying that we run around saying everybody's racist, or that we run around trying to, accuse people of things that they are not, but we do want to make people aware that, ignorance can result in bias. Simply being unaware of things that other people go through or things that other people have suffered, that can result in you acting in a biased way without even meaning to. You may not think that you're doing anything intentional, or you may not think you're doing anything that's hurting someone when in fact it can. There can be some pretty innocent seeming questions or innocent seeming ways that we talk to people who are different than us or have different life experiences and cultural experiences. And we can come across as, if not biased, then at least very ignorant, and it can be hurtful without meaning to be. So we're not trying to turn anyone off by accusing people of being overtly or intentionally racist. We just need to understand that, intended or not, it's something that we want to try to have our eyes open to, be more aware of.
Do you think one reason that this happens is, to go to the royal law and love the Lord thy God and love thy neighbor as thyself? In that society, and I think society has always been like this, where we can be very selfish and just think about ourselves, and just associate with people like us, and just be very self-absorbed, very self-aware, all those self words, when what you're talking about is others. It's being aware of others, esteeming others better than yourself, loving others, treating others like you want to be treated. All of those things help solve this issue, right? Or should. They should solve. If we apply them, then we start hopefully becoming more impartial. I would think, or more unbiased, or however you want to put it.
I think so. I think the key to overcoming selfishness is to exercise empathy and to work at being able to see what other people are experiencing, being able to understand, even if you haven't gone through it yourself. And we're not saying that it's possible to understand everything that someone else is feeling, but making the effort to insert yourself into that situation and try to not see how you would react to it, but understand how they're reacting to it. And once you practice doing that, and once you work at doing that, trying to see things through other people's eyes, then it does make it a lot easier, and it does start to get toward recognizing those things when they occur, if they're unintended. You start to pick up on them. You start to catch them.
Yeah. All right. So what sort of ideas do we want to look at?
Well, so I thought maybe we'd look now at some of the examples in the early church, looking at how bias and prejudice impacted the church, some of the negative impacts that it has, and then also looking at some of the ways in which the early church was showing bias. So as far as ways that it impacts the church, I think creating divisions is one of the most obvious ones. I mean, whether that's actual segregation where, you can't worship with us, you have your own church, we have our own church, that kind of thing. That there's no example of that that's condoned in the New Testament church. Instead, what we see is that they need to work together. They need to dwell together. They need to welcome one another, even if they have differences in the church.
So what sort of things were leading to those divisions in the early church?
Yeah. So examples that we have, one of the obvious ones is that, you had the Jews who came out of Judaism. They came out of being God's people, the kingdom of Israel. And Jesus was in Judea. Jesus, revealed himself to the Jews first. But the message that Jesus preached and the church that he established was for Jew and Gentile, Jew and Greek. But what we see in the New Testament is that there were many who struggled and had difficulty with the incorporating of Gentiles and Jews together. There were Jews who believed that Jewish practices needed to be enforced when they didn't need to be, and they were trying to ensure that the Gentiles adhered to that. There were Gentiles who had their own baggage. Maybe they came from Greek religions or pagan faiths, and there's passages that deal with some of the confusions or some of the hardships that they had in kind of getting past that ingrained teaching that they'd learned before.
Yeah, I mean, if, to just use us as an example, do you want to be the Jew or do you want to be the Gentile?
I'll be the Gentile.
You'll be the Gentile, I'll be the Jew. Okay, so I come onto the scene and, I have much advantage in every way because unto me has been delivered the oracles of God. And I have my beard cut a certain way. I have tassels on my garments. Don't ask me to work on Saturday. It's not going to happen. Circumcision of the flesh, obviously. Dietary laws. If you invite me over for supper, I want to know what's on the menu. I'm bringing all of those things to the table, right? That's my baggage that I'm bringing with me.
Right.
Okay, now what are you bringing with you?
Well, I'm used to Greek culture. I'm used to, the arrangement of society in Greek culture. I'm used to, like you said, I've got my own kind of clothing that I'm used to wearing. I've got my own kind of food that I'm used to eating.
Are you one of them? Were you one of them? They're pagans. Are you that sort of Gentile? Are you coming from paganism?
Probably, yeah. I was probably, diehard for Apollos or Athena or somebody.
So if we are having a meal, where are you probably going to be getting your meat from?
I'm probably quite accustomed to, going to the pagan temples where they had the meat markets, and that's something that's addressed, directly in Scripture. That was an issue.
But I mean, you have these different people coming from very different directions, or however you want to put it, backgrounds. And it's like, man, how are they ever going to be able to get along? And you better believe there is some bias there. If even, Peter in Galatians 2, when Paul withstood him to the face, because when certain men came from James, it talks about it, and he would eat, it's like, that's bias. That's prejudice. He was showing favoritism. That's what all those things are.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it was an issue, just the culture and the Jew-Gentile difference.
Yeah. And I think what you see, the Jews tried to, I think everyone's natural reaction is we try to make our environment more comfortable for us. And I think the way that, for instance, the Jews were trying to make their environment more comfortable was, well, let's just make sure everybody is circumcised, or let's have everybody keep the Sabbath, or, whatever it was. If they could bind what they were familiar with, well, then they would feel more comfortable knowing that everyone in the church was on the same page as them.
Yeah, the big one, circumcision. It's like, right. Okay, you got the sign of the covenant,
right? But that was the wrong way of going about it. And the apostles and the as they were bringing the message, they had to correct that mentality that, no, the solution is not to make them more like you. The right. solution is not to force them to adopt your ways.
Yeah, and Paul actually, there Paul is, when Paul speaks about himself, and he's like, I'm a Jew of the Jews. He was a Pharisee, tribe of Benjamin, all these things, and yet when he's speaking to the Gentiles, he says, and he's dealing with this issue of the Judaizers, and he says, I became like you. And he's saying, I'm putting those things behind me. I'm recognizing those things are of the old covenant, and we're in the new covenant. Why would you want to go back? It's like, I became like you. Why would you want to effectively become like the Jews? Mm-hmm. And it's like, no, we need to move on and come on into the new covenant and the gospel.
To look at a passage, 1 Corinthians 10 is one where Paul is talking about the issue of the meat markets that we mentioned earlier. He concludes chapter 10 with, in verse 31, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Then he says, give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. So Paul here says, first of all, not to give offense to the Jews or to the Greeks. It's not that one is superior and one is inferior. There's none of that. And then he says, I seek to please everyone. Now, does that mean Paul was a people pleaser? Does that mean Paul was just out for folks' approval?
He was concerned about their conscience.
He's concerned about their conscience. He's concerned about them being saved because he's seeking their advantage, not his own. And seeking someone else's advantage means that what you might prefer isn't what's important. And
all the passages like kingdom of God is not eating and drinking. It's like that concept of liberties that we've spoken about before on this podcast. It's like the Gentiles are going to need to recognize liberties. The Jews are going to need to recognize liberties because both parties are going to be doing things that it would be very easy to have prejudices come up. And so they had to recognize they needed to recognize these liberties and bear with one another and be long-suffering with one another and to esteem others better than themselves.
Yeah. And, we've been talking about this in the context of Jews and Gentiles and this New Testament example. I think using that same line of thinking, we can start thinking about the same from a modern context, starting with food. Have you ever heard people talk about foods of a certain culture or people who eat a certain culture's food? And I've heard some pretty hurtful things said before about, their food smells a certain way, or, their food tastes a certain way. I get that people have preferences. If you don't want to try something or if you don't want to eat something, nobody's making you do anything you don't want to do. But the point is one better than another? Is one really superior to another when you think about it? No, you're just thinking about that in terms of only from my perspective, only what my preference is. I think language is another one. If someone comes to this country, you need to speak English now that you're in this country. Have you ever heard that said? And to that, why? You just have to ask yourself, why is that something where you're holding up one as superior to another? Certainly there can be some difficulty that arises if someone walked into our assembly and spoke a language that none of us knew how to speak. We would struggle to help that person. Although I would say, we don't have the Holy Spirit giving us the gift of tongues to speak to them anymore, but we do have Google Translate, which is pretty impressive in terms of what it can do, real time. But favoring one over another just arbitrarily, or just believing wholesale that, that unless you're speaking my language, I'm going to look down on you. That's another way in which we can do that same thing today.
The whole concept of, and what we're really talking about is pride, right? Right. If we're looking down on someone, it's like that's pride.
Yeah, I mean, it's just
that's my way's better than your way.
I'm somehow better by default.
And I think you can see that culturally, because we live in America, Murica, America. And yes, that was sarcasm, in case anyone doesn't know how sarcastic I can be. I think you also see that when it comes to economics, and you saw that in Scripture, in James, when it talks about if a rich man comes into your assembly and you show him, what's the word it uses, favor, or you tell the poor man, sit here at my feet, and
right.
you however it phrases it, that you have bias towards the rich. And I think you see that, you see these things affecting the church. And that's just a fact that you see riches, you see culture. Just for example, when it comes to culture, I'm not sure. Like I said, I know people have favorite foods, things like that. But let's use there's a fairly good sized Indian population here in Columbus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm again trying to use this as an example. I think it would be very easy just because of culture. Oh, they're probably all Hindus, aren't they? Well, I don't know that.
Yeah, that would be.
I don't know that.
Assumption.
That's a preconception. That's a bias. Well, so that can very easily lead to, well, what good would it really do to talk to them about the gospel because they're all Hindus? And so now, because of a different culture, a different background, all of a sudden you're withholding the gospel. You're withholding the place where we should find the unity in faith. Mm-hmm. And we start, there is only one way. Jesus is the way. And everything should be funneling towards him. But if all of a sudden, because of bias towards a culture, Hispanics, oh, well, obviously all Hispanics are Catholics. And it's like, no, that's not the case. But people have that preconception just because, for whatever reason. And it's like, it doesn't matter what they are. The whole point, or one of the points of the sower passage, because what we're going to have to talk about is how do you solve the problem? How do you deal with this issue? And when it comes to the parable of the sower, and you sow indiscriminately. In Matthew chapter 13, a sower went out to sow. He sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, some on stony places, some among thorns, some on good ground. And the only way the sower knew it was good ground is by what came up. Mm-hmm. It wasn't based on what it looked like. It's like, no, you sow indiscriminately. And when you sow indiscriminately, whatever comes up, comes up. And I mean, we teach that song to little kids as far as what people look like, black, white, red. Those things, if you sow indiscriminately, then you will harvest indiscriminately. Let me put it like that.
Yeah. And and you're right. It's so easy to say, and it's so easy to point to these examples from Scripture and say, look, they're show no partiality. There's no partiality with God. Why do we make distinction? There is no distinction.
Yeah.
We read that in Scripture. But in practice, it can be very, very hard, especially if you've lived your whole life never having really been challenged on this before, or never having tried to challenge yourself on it before. It can just be hard to get past that idea of, well, they won't listen to me, or, well, I won't be able to come across in any way that will resonate with them, because we're so different, or, or hopefully not, but even having more negative ideas about, oh, well, we don't really want them coming into the church, and it's going to change the way the church feels, and it's going to change the makeup of the church. I mean, that's an even more sinister kind of way of thinking about it.
But I've heard people say it.
But it happens. It absolutely happens.
And I know we were hesitant to speak about the local church here, so I'll speak about a local church someplace else that I know of, a church down south that I'm familiar with, and we spoke about this issue where the town, the city where it was, and it was just a small town, but the town was 70% African American. That was the makeup of the town. The church was 100% white.
Mm-hmm.
There was a white church in town, and there was a black church in town. And that's how, regardless of religion, that's how the Baptists were. That's how the churches were. There was a black church and there was a white church, and that sort of thing still happens today. And people who are oblivious to that are somewhat willfully oblivious. It's like it still happens.
There's a moral contradiction in that. And people live comfortably with moral contradiction all the time.
And the only way I know that happens is if people are sowing discriminately.
Mm-hmm.
If we sow discriminately, well, then guess what happens? You're going to reap discriminately.
Mm-hmm.
If you sow indiscriminately, then, and I'll tell you right now, there were people who spoke about, oh, you're just trying to change the makeup of the church. It's like, I'm just trying to sow the seed. That's all we're trying to do. It's like, we don't care what people look like.
Yeah.
We don't care what they come from. They're people, and they were made in the image of God, and we're just trying to sow the seed. Right. And whatever happens, happens.
Yeah, the negative impacts it brings on the church. You brought up that it hinders the word. It hinders the message. I think the ultimate conclusion that leads to, the last one I had, was it brings reproach on the church. If you let bias and if you let prejudice define how the church operates, that's going to be evident to people outside. That's going to be known to people when they look at the church and the work that it does, and who they're bringing into their fold. And eventually you get to the point where people say, oh, you have completely segregated churches in your town? Well, maybe I don't want any part of that. It brings reproach on the church.
Yeah. And I think what has to happen is maturity on all parties involved, and that we have to learn to sow indiscriminately. And the reason is because the word is indiscriminate.
Mm-hmm.
And so now people have to receive the word indiscriminately. And so, for example, that place I was speaking of, there were people who didn't look like other people. That's a horrible way to put it. There were folks who were African American who became Christians, and they had a lot of trouble because they were in the minority,
mm-hmm.
and they were the only ones there. In some cases, they were the only one there, and they eventually fell away because they could not get over that hurdle.
Mm-hmm.
They did not have the root within themselves to say, you know what, I know I don't look like everybody else, but that's not what this is about. This is about worshiping the Lord.
Yeah.
This is about loving others. This is about Jews loving Gentiles, Gentiles loving Jews, rich loving the poor, poor loving the rich, men, women, slaves, free, and whatever they look like. It's like that is immaterial.
Yeah, it definitely should be. But,
that takes maturity to do that.
It does. The low-level distinctions that we draw between each other, race or culture, those are the first barriers. And so often we don't even step beyond that. That's enough to keep people from really interacting with each other. I think what we're getting into, what are the solutions to this? What are the solutions, and what needs to be done in the church to deal with this issue of bias and prejudice? I think the first we've been talking about is going out and exposing yourself to people of all kinds, people of all cultures, people of all races. Exposure and being educated on, that there's people different than you, that you're not the only kind of person there is in the world, and learning to come to grips with that, not being afraid, overcoming whatever fears that you might have of interacting with people who are different. I wanted to go to 1 Corinthians 11, because I think what you were beginning to speak to, someone who is in the minority, say, and they join a church, and then they leave after a period of time because they don't feel like they were welcomed, or they don't feel like they were, and what I'm getting to is involved in the work. It has to take more than just getting someone in. You have to also involve that person, include that person. In 1 Corinthians 11, it's talking about the Lord's Supper, but there's divisions in that process. They're splitting up into groups, and one group takes the Lord's Supper the way they want to, when they want to. Another group takes it when they want to, and there's divisions as a result. And he says, you're not coming together for the better, it's for the worse that you're coming together.
Can we pause there for a second?
Yeah, sure.
So what were the divisions in Corinth? Because some of those divisions were not things that we've spoken about yet. And it's like you start at the beginning. It's like, okay, there's been divisions reported by Chloe's household. And one says, I'm a Peter. One says, I'm a Paul. One says, I'm of Apollos. Mm-hmm. So you had favorite teachers.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the things you have.
Seems so.
Well, that's favoritism. And he actually makes the point in chapter 2 or chapter 3 where he says, what am I and what is Apollos? And he says, all things are yours. And it's like, I'm working for you. Apollos is working for you. Mm-hmm. We're all working for you. Why are you choosing one over another? And it didn't make any sense, but that was one of the ways that they were showing bias. Mm-hmm. I think another way is with the gifts, where you can tell they were biased towards one gift, namely speaking in tongues. And he's like, no, there's going to come a time where this is going to pass away, so you better get off that kick. Mm-hmm. But there were things that were leading to these divisions. And I was just thinking, within that conversation about the miraculous gifts, those things have passed away. But certainly we have 1 talent, 2 talent, 5 talent people in the church. And it would be very easy to be biased towards one or the other. 1, 2, 5 talent. It'd be very easy. One thing we've already touched on, like the widows. And in 1 Corinthians, is it 1 Corinthians 12, where it's the weaker things. And it's like, it's very easy to say, oh, we don't need you. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, no, you do need them, because they give you an opportunity to do things. So anyway, I just wanted to touch on that, just because there were those divisions were for somewhat of a different reason than what we've already seen.
And do you think it's possible too? I know there was sin brought up in 1 Corinthians where there was members of some families or individuals who were still attending the church there was sin being overlooked. And the fact that it was being overlooked means there were clearly some people who were on their side, or were at least willing to be passive about it.
And that's interesting, because in my notes you asked, okay, how do we solve this? And one of the things I have is that we have to discipline indiscriminately. And, in 2 Corinthians, when it talks about that fellow there in 1 Corinthians 5, when he repents, and it says the punishment that was inflicted by the majority. Well, if the majority inflicted the punishment, if the majority did what they were supposed to, what had the minority done? They had not done it. Why? Mm-hmm. All you can do is speculate, but I don't think it's a bad speculation. There was family there. There were people, it's like, why aren't you doing what it specifically says that they were being tested, and they were showing favoritism, and they were not, some of them were not disciplining like they should have.
Yeah.
Well, why would you not do that? And that's where you see bias come out.
Yeah, whatever the reason it is that they're divided here. He also says in verse 19 that there are factions among you.
Right.
Whatever the reason is, it implies that it's based on favor. It's based on preference. People are ultimately self-selecting what group they want to associate with based on preference.
It's not a coincidence that 1 Corinthians is one of the books that has the discussion of liberties, right? Like we've already spoken about.
Yeah. But the reason I was in 1 Corinthians 11 is what Paul is prescribing here for them when they're coming together to take the Lord's Supper. He says toward the end of the chapter, verse 33, so then, brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that when you come together, it will not be for judgment. About the other things I will give direction when I come. Basically, he sums up the solution for them by saying, there needs to be a breakdown of these factions. There needs to be in a sense, a dismantling of these factions based on preference. And you need to give, instead of preference, deference to one another by waiting for one another.
It's a good way to put it. Yep, very much so. So in thinking about solutions, like tarry one for another, and you better, it's going to be up to them to apply these things, frankly. And in my notes, I just have, for one thing, I was thinking of what Paul says to the Athenians. There has to be a realization that God has made from one blood every nation. And there's a reason for that. That what's it say? That they may grope for him and find him, though he is not far from him. It uses that sort of language, that it's like one blood, every nation, and we have to accept that, frankly. And if we don't accept that, it's just showing bias and prejudice on our part.
Yeah, I mean, I've even heard the point made, and I have been using the term races in this episode, but I even have a belief myself that there's no biological or scientific distinction between races. Race is a completely socially generated idea, and we're one species, we're one kind when it comes to humanity.
Yeah. Actually, Sunday morning, the lesson's going to be lessons from the garden and how God made everything according to its kind. And that when you have, different colored birds, they're still birds. You have different dogs that look differently. They're still dogs.
Yeah.
And that is actually, the word is genus, from where we get the word gene, and in one of the manuscripts, but it's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
One blood, that idea, all nations.
It's a fascinating thing, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I read a book that was the researcher who led the Human Genome Project. This was back in the 90s when they first mapped the human genome all the way through. And their findings, and what he showed in his findings, was that there's no distinguishable gene for various races. There were people who were expecting to find that, or thought that would be a discovery, and the discovery was the exact opposite. There's no genetic predictor for what we would call a person's race, meaning that even if you're an expert in this, you can't necessarily look at a genome and know what race, in quotation marks, that person is.
Right.
And this was kind of applauded at first as, wow, this is going to end so much of people's wrong ideas, and just the sad reality of how those ideas really don't care about what the facts are, or don't care about what the reality is. Sometimes people just continue thinking the way they want to think.
Yeah.
But we're trying to get beyond that.
I mean, some of the concepts that solve this are so foundational, so basic, and I mean, it's just, if we are going to claim to be Christians, you just either do it or you don't. And I'm just thinking of Matthew chapter 5, where it's, you've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, that's bias. And he says, no, I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you. Right? You have all that conversation. Bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. What is that? That is unbiased. That's what that is. That's impartiality. Verse 46, for if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's Sermon on the Mount. That's almost day one for the Lord's ministry. It's like, this is foundational stuff. This is what it means to be a Christian. And I think that's how you solve these issues. And it's just a question of applying it. That it's like, I understand people have differences. Man, do you love one another?
Yeah.
And it goes to sowing in my notes, I have sowing indiscriminately. Yeah. That should go to solving this.
Right. It's not enough just to know that that's the reality, that, we know that all people are equal. Yeah, we know that all people are, of one blood. We're all of one humanity. But it's not enough just to know that. We have to also act aware of that fact and act where we're not,
we have to be cognizant of it in our own lives.
Yeah, we have to be aware of it, educated on it, but we also have to act on it.
And the example before we started recording that I used was, we can talk about the Good Samaritan, and we can talk about loving our neighbor, and we can talk about loving our enemies, and we can talk about all these things on Sunday morning. And then on Monday, when it comes time to find some place to live, and it's like, well, you don't want to go on that street because that's a bad street. That's the bad side of town. They have a lower socioeconomic status. It's, it's this, it's that. And it's like, wait a minute, what is going on here? That on Sunday, we talked about being unbiased. And then on Monday, when it comes to actual decision making, there's a lot of bias.
Yeah. And so much of that is almost reflex to people. You don't always realize you're doing it. And that's what we're trying to make people aware of.
And what you start getting into is things like white flight.
Yeah.
And you start getting into those issues. And I remember there's a sermon by Brother Ronnie Milliner, and it was a great sermon. And he is a very technical fella. But it's a very good sermon, and it was showing metropolitan areas, and it was showing where the churches were located over the past 75 years. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, the location of where the Christians met moved further and further away from the inner city. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, well, what's the makeup of the church? Funny enough, would you like to guess what it was? It was reflective of white flight. And it's like, and it's bias. That's what it is. And we just have to be cognizant of it in our own lives and in our own minds. And we have to fight against it in our own minds. We just have to. So
be cognizant, but also, be aware when it's happening, even if it's not something that you're choosing or causing to happen. Be aware that it happens. And I would add to that, be aware when the other side of that, the harm that people feel because of it, be aware when other people are suffering that.
Yeah.
You and I both have not experienced things in our lives by virtue of just what we look like that other people have to deal with. You and I would probably talk to a police officer or think differently in our heads about what it means to talk to a police officer than someone else who has had, friends and family experience that very, very differently. So it's being aware, but it's also being aware of the other too, being aware of others. And that goes back to the empathy.
Yeah.
One more thing I wanted to cover when it comes to solutions to this, we've talked about involving people. I think there's an importance of making sure that people are heard and making sure that people are included. And another example of that I wanted to look at was Acts chapter 6. We'll summarize it quickly, but in the church there was a complaint. There were Hellenists who were Greeks. They were complaining that the Hebrews, who apparently were in the majority in this church, were neglecting the Greek widows when they were distributing the daily bread. And so the apostles are there, and they decide, we're going to select men from the congregation from among you, and they're going to help with dealing with this problem. And you look at the list of names of who they choose, and there are multiple Greek names in that list. They list Stephen, Philip, Prochorus, Niacor, Timon, and can hardly see this. Parmenas, Nicholas. I don't know the full etymology of all those names, but there are Greek names in that list. And the point that I wanted to bring out from this is whether it was intended or not, the passage doesn't say if it was intentional or if they were being malicious toward the Hellenistic widows, but
obviously it was breaking down.
Obviously there was a breakdown.
Those lines.
Yeah, obviously it was breaking across those lines, and whoever was
in wasn't authority, the native-borns who were being neglected.
Yeah, whoever was in the position of authority was overlooking that. They were not seeing the need when it was there. And part of the solution was the people who are going to be in the people who are going to be given roles and work to do, and I would say people given authority in this matter, involved a mixture. It involved including the people who were being excluded so that oversight wouldn't happen again. And I think that's an important thing to look at. We were talking about leadership of the church, And if you had a church that was split 50-50, let's just say 50% black, 50% white, and all your elders were white, you might raise some eyebrows at that. Why is that being selected out? Why is that being the way that things are? And
it would be like having a congregation, 50% Jew and 50% Gentile, and all the elders were Jews.
Apparently that's probably
pretty
the situation
close.
That was happening here, or something like it. Yeah.
Something similar. And it's like, it would just make you raise your eyebrows. Now, maybe there's reasons for it, but it would still make you raise your eyebrows. And it's like, wait a minute, are we, and it should cause you to examine the situation.
Yeah. I mean, you just have to ask yourself, is there a reason why you think that we'll use the Jew-Gentile distinction. Is there a reason why you think a Jewish or a Hebrew Christian is better suited for leadership, or is better suited to work in the church than someone else? And we go right back to, there should be no fear of difference. There should be no fear of different cultures, different people, and to be indiscriminate in how we involve the work of others in the church. And when people are involved like this, and when people are heard like this, it stops people from being lost in the church. It stops people from falling through the cracks and being ignored. I think so much of the people that are in the church but leave, they leave because they're allowed to leave, and not, you understand what I'm saying here. We're not, barring the doors and locking them in. We allow them to leave because we allow them to be anonymous, or we allow them to be unheard, or we allow them to not be involved in anything. And who wants that? Who wants to stay in a body where they're not involved in anything, or where they're partitioned off and not treated like everyone else?
Yep, very much so. I could go on and on about that.
There's so many things that we could go off on tangents with this topic, but I think it's an important discussion. And again, we're not trying to point our fingers or accuse people of malice that isn't there, but we want to ask that, think about why things are the way they are. If you don't know the history of why things are the way they are, look for it. Look into how things have gotten the way that they are, and by being understanding and by exposing ourselves to differences, that's the biggest cure for bias, is exposure and familiarization. And once that occurs, it can open up so many doors for the gospel. It can open up so many doors for service.
I was just thinking, you kind of started in Ephesians chapter 4 and all of those things, and yet Paul says, he introduces it with, I beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you were called. And it's like, you need to be pursuing these things, pursuing the things that make for peace, pursuing these things that make for unity. It's like, it doesn't just happen. Mm-hmm. It has to be pursued. It has to be made to happen, because bias is everywhere, along with a lot of other things. So we have to have our eyes open and walk circumspectly as it is. We have to be observant in our own minds, and so that we can help others. Look, what's the Hebrews passage? Looking carefully, lest any root of bitterness springing up causes many to be defiled. Yeah. It's like we have to look carefully.
Look carefully, and don't be passive when you see things that aren't the way they should be. When you see things that are unjust or not right, don't just be content to live with the moral contradiction.
Yep, there you go. Andrew, I appreciate you having me on the podcast this week.
we are co-hosts. There is no hierarchy among us. We're unified. We're on equal planes, right?
Yep. We just switched it up a little bit, but I enjoyed the study. Appreciated it.
Thank you, John, and thanks to everyone for listening. And keep having ears to hear.